Okay, it's just after 1 o'clock as folks sort of trickle in here. I want to welcome you to the next installment of the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar Series here in the Human Environment Systems Group at Boise State. My name is Matt Williamson. I'm an assistant professor here. Before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of an orientation. We're going to record the session today. We will send out the link to that video to whatever email you used to register. Everyone's going to start out being muted, and we're going to ask that you sort of hold questions until the end. Also, please turn off your camera so that we can avoid any lags during the presentation. When we get to the question and answer session at the end, we'll turn cameras back on. You can check out the rest of the schedule and register for any of the future webinars at the link here, and also the link that will show up in the email with the video. Finally, I just want to acknowledge that it's been a fairly long summer for a lot of folks between the pandemic and continuing racial violence and now the wildfires in the West. It's not been a particularly easy time. We're really thankful that you've decided to spend this hour with us and hope that you will be kind to each other and to yourselves. Now, I'm extremely grateful to be able to introduce James Sanovia from Oglala Lakota College. Mr. Sanovia has an associate's degree in pre-engineering from Oglala Lakota and a BS and MS in geological engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. All of that work has been emphasized towards cultural geospatial applications. James is nearing about 20 years of cultural science, place-based mapping, and 10 years as an Oglala Lakota College instructor teaching geospatial and engineering related topics. Through the guidance of cultural advisors, James has been addressing environmental, cultural, and sovereignty issues through indigenous-centered land mapping. Crazy Horse is often quoted as, "My lands are where my dead lie buried. One does not sell the earth upon which the people walk." James strives to center indigenous lands through cultural mapping in support of decolonization initiatives. As part of that effort, he started Makówapi Wítaya Enterprises, a Lakota-based cultural mapping collective as part of the Rosebud Sioux tribal organization. Mr. Sanovia was born during the American Indian movement, where his mother comes from the Rosebud Sioux tribe and his father from the Oglala Sioux tribe, both in South Dakota. Mr. Sanovia gets his continuous support from his wife Lily and their children, and through these initiatives also strives to give voice to all two-legged, four-legged, winged ones, and all of plant life, thus protecting Turtle Island with indigenous values and virtues for ways of knowing to help move forward in today's world. Mr. Sanovia has been presenting indigenous-centered mapping across the nation at tribal colleges, major universities, government entities, and to the public for almost 2 decades. It is time for the indigenous people to be the producers of maps of indigenous places, and James has been leading such an initiative, and we're extremely fortunate to have him here today. So with that, I'll turn it over to James. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I first got to admit that my glasses broke the other day, and I had to order them. Normally it's 1 day, but apparently they have to send away from them. So hopefully they won't fall apart in the middle of that, or it'll be really funny if they do. All right, let's see here. So yeah, I'd like to thank Matt, Chelsea, Megan. I forgot how to say her name. Chatu. Sorry. Thank Megan I met Megan at a neon conference about this time last year, and she invited me and introduced me to Matt and to kind of talk about the things I do. And I'd like to thank you all for having me here. So, how Jim Imachiab, Sichangu Lakota Eteha Waeuelo. So, it's nice to meet you. My name is Jim. I come from the Burnt Thigh Nation, or the Rosebud people. I am one of the bands of the Lakota Oyate. There are 7 bands to the Lakota, and I am one of them. Although my parents come from each of the bands, I am a tribally enrolled member through the Rosebud Sioux tribe. So this presentation is called, various names. I never really know what to call it, so I just call it everything. It's a mixture of just things I've done, whether it's culture, science, or engineering. But it mainly bases around the Black Hills area. Things I've done and people who I've worked with along this endeavor. And, more recently, I've kind of tagged on Makówapi Wítaya. Doing a literal translation means geography together. I am not a fluent speaker, and I am not a historian. I'm an engineer who does a lot of cultural geography work. So I give it a weird twist on some of the things I do. But I know some phrases, I know I'm not a historian, but I'm starting to become one, whether I want to be or not. So a little bit about my background, like I told you all, my mom's from Rosebud. My dad's from Pine Ridge. I'm working with my dad at the Air Force Base here, and he looked at me. There's some people doing some soil sampling out at the base. He was a painter. I'm painting with him. He goes, he looked at me, and he only said this once. He goes, you should do something for the earth. Unchumaka needs our help. I'm like 18 or 19. That didn't sink in till years later, but I carry that with me. Like Matt was saying, here's my degrees. I got hired on officially in 2011 as a lab manager, and now I'm a faculty. And one of the more notable things I'll talk about are my internships. So I've been doing ArcGIS for 17 years, now diving into pro. I teach geospatial classes and engineering courses. The late Wilmer Metzdeth, one of my past cultural advisors. I don't do anything without a cultural advisor, by the way, whether it's an engineering project, science project, or a combo of all those in culture. He loved high tech. He was always in my office. I have a terrestrial LiDAR camera, and he was always had ideas for me. And one thing he wanted to talk about was false stories and place naming can lead to false perception and understanding, and even written into law. He has been on he is on Tribal Historic Preservation, which is a leading board for the tribal governance, and he's worked with the USGS and all that to change names that people have falsely named things. So he always told me, be careful what you put out there. Real things could happen with it. Okay. So before we move on, I like to state this. I'm older now, probably a lot older than you think. And I'm not afraid to be blunt now, as I was when I was younger. And I think people need to hear this, and I've gotten good. It helps with communication. First and foremost, you should know there's a lack, no matter how nice you think a conversation's going, how great a project you think is going, there's just that lack of trust between natives, and I can use my tribe or the Lakota Oyate people as an example, and with white people or Washichus, we distinguish. There's a difference there. You want to be on the white person side, white people. Washichu is, not necessarily, you know, there's Sichu. Sicha is, means bad. So Sicha is part of that word in there. And so you kind of get the idea of, there's those people too. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be white to be Washichu, although it's used a lot in films and other things to refer to white people. So another thing I like to explain, and I've noticed this a lot, this indigenous name, indigenous, its use, which is great. People are wanting to indigenize things, and I think that's really cool. So I'm careful, and I like to promote on how I believe this should be used. I think there's a place for indigenous, that word, and the idea of it. There's, you know, so I have here indigenous versus self-proclaimed Native American. Someone could say I'm indigenous to this area. Well, okay. I don't know what that means, really. It's general. And then when I say, if I say I have Native American ancestry, it's like, yeah, I have some, you know, some bloodline somewhere with great, great, great grandma, you know, that's great. There's that. And then there's verse Lakota, any tribe really, but like I said, I'm using Lakota, Native American, saying, well, and that's kind of like self-proclaimed, but I'm self-proclaiming Lakota Native American versus a tribal enrolled member. You could have someone claiming it and saying, I'm from the Lakota people. Versus there's a difference between saying, I'm a Lakota tribal enrolled member. I notice there's a difference there on people's agendas and what they're after, what they want. And then there's tribal enrolled members from the res, or born and raised or not born and raised on the res. I am not raised on the res. Like I said in the bio, I was born during the American Indian movement. So our parents moved away from the res right during that time to get us away from the res, me and my brothers. So if you want to learn more or talk more about that, I'm welcome to. But I just wanted you to know that these are things I look into, because I work a lot with outside people out of our college, which is usually white males. Lately, it's been white females, which is pretty cool. And I have to think about all this, because my culture advisors ask me who I'm working with. Why are you doing this? What do they want from you? What do they want, Jim? You know, it's always, what do they want? And what are we going to get out of it? All right. Enough of that. Moving on. So just a quick little outline on how this started. You know, it started off with, believe it or not, a German professor I had at my tribal college. It's back in like 2000, I think. We did a project together. He's a geologist, and we did a project on Inipi rocks. So it all kind of started there. And I also did some studying streams, Woolman Pebbles count. I don't know if you know what that is, and some other stream classification. So it started all this, everything I'm gonna do starts with those. And then immediately after that, I did a couple of internships, and those got me thinking on the technology side of things. And then kind of the journey here, I kind of take you, in a way, I take you through a journey of the projects I've done through this. So examples of early GIS. So here's that Black Hills rocks for a sweat lodge. So we picked rocks from the Black Hills. It's a very sad looking Inipi there, by the way. I always have to say that. But I didn't want to take a picture of anybody's actual Inipi. So I went to the IHS hospital, the Indian Health Service hospital, and they had some people that they let use their grounds that put together an Inipi for their, you know, patient use. And they have a nicer one now, by the way. So we did rocks, and, you know, this was my first experience combining culture and science. You know, we did some XRD here, near infrared spectroscopy. And so, you know, finding out what rocks are the best, at least in our area. Just so you know, it ended up being the amphibolite. Second place was the Metagraywacke. So starting to work with cultural people. Um, here's the little area I'll be talking about. So here is okay. Here is the general area of, I guess, how do I say this? So working with elders over these last 17, almost, maybe longer than that, almost 2 decades, many of our elders, Lakota, Dakota, or the Nakota, elders have talked about the height of the Lakota back in its day. And they talk about it being 16 states and 3 Canadian provinces. And I'm like, what? It wasn't until last night I just drew some polygons just for the fun of it, which I'll show you in the next slide, just to see what that looked like. And I'm like, oh man, this is gonna raise a havoc with other tribes. They're gonna lose their mind over these borders. And you know what? They should. But I think the argument should be made between those tribes. I'll get to that. So here I just kind of threw in some, and I'm like, that was the height of the Lakota domain and the height of their power in the areas they control. And I'm not really sure about these borders. I just kind of guesstimated, the Flatirons over in Boulder, which they don't accept. So I'm going to change that. We have winter counts. Winter counts or hides our people drew on for historical events, and we have other ways to prove that was part of our world over there, up to the Flatirons. And down, I'm not sure how far these other borders are, but they're over there somewhere. I know we have stories of the Carolinas as well. They say we even have cave drawings in there, and so it's interesting. All this is done on the side, by the way. Everything I'm showing you, not everything, but 90% of this presentation, I have to do on the side. I'm busy with other engineering work topics for work. So this is done on my own time. So it's kind of just zooming into the Black Hills where I'm pointing. Traditionally, it's called Hesapa, Black Mountains, but English-speaking people don't like guttural languages. So I said, you got an easier way to say that. So they came up with Paha Sapa, which is Black Butte or Black Hills, which is what it's commonly called now. And it's shaped like a heart, which I'll talk about. You can see how it's kind of shaped like a heart. I will explain later how I can show that geologically and hydrologically, how it being a heart. So one of my more recent culture advisors, High Horse, he asked me, I told him I was presenting to you guys. And so he goes, well, what's GIS? Or what's geospatial? He's a Lakota historian, and he teaches in Lakota Studies Department and fluent speaker. Lakota is his first language. And so I told him what all that was. And then so he just sat there and thought about it, and he goes, He sapaki wakeye yanke. He goes, that's how I say it's geospatial to me. He's all, there's a black aura over the hills. It's a place for spirits, medicine, clean water, a prayer place. He goes, that's how I'm thinking of geospatial when you tell me that. Okay, kind of backtracking. This is like one of the first maps I ever made, both of these. And I tried to present the one on the left to the Sintigleska University over in Rosebud, to the Lakota Studies Department, and I didn't get much out of them. The first meeting was, didn't get a whole lot accomplished. So I went back to the meeting and I got rid of the borders. And boy, the story started to flow once I got rid of those borders and the highways and just made it what they were probably taught on that idea. And so, I made it blue. I don't know why I made it blue in here. The racetrack, it should be red. This blue circle that goes around the hill. So that's the story of the racetrack. There's a few different versions. You know, I don't have time to tell you the whole story, but it's about Magpie hitching a ride on Tatonka's ear is one version, and ended up flying off because Tatonka's, it's his land, the buffalo, by the way, Tatonka. And so either he hitched a ride or he hid. And also that the race was ran by all the animals in the Ikchewik Chasha, the common man, common person, was in the race too. He didn't stand a chance, or she, or whoever it was. But Tatonka was expected to win because it's his land. And so they were said all the animals raced around here, and the reason why it's red is because of their feet bled. They all wanted to win so bad. It was the fate of the people, two-leggeds, you know, Wakantaka, Tunkashla, you know, grandfather, or you could think of him as God, although we don't think that way, was needed to find a way for the fate of the two-legged, the people, because we were being naughty with the land and with each other. And so this race was to determine. And so anyway, the jackrabbit still thinks it's going on. One of my mom's friends, Elaine Dolores, she passed recently, but she told me a side story, and I've heard it from a couple other people, that the jackrabbit, if you see the jackrabbit out in the Badlands, you're supposed to tell it that the race is over and go home. So, you know, this is just an elevation layer with a line. This is another very early map I made, just starting to learn GIS, but I leave it here because it's a reminder that this race still carries on to this day. There's a group of people who honor this race and they run it. I don't know how many days it takes them, but they run it in honor of everything that it represents. And so, you know, still an early map. I'm starting to learn my culture. And I thought, you know, this is Landsat data, in the wrong projection, by the way, but it's okay. Why can't I make it red? If I heard this looks like a heart, so I made it look like a red heart just for the fun of it. Still, you know, starting to learn things. And, you know, all along I'm working with Sinti Gillespie University and those culture advisors on just learning things. And I'm getting a little better, you know, I think I'm at School of Mines now. And so, but the tribal college OLC that I went to, Lakota College, asked me to keep working for them. They wanted to know how the cottonwood tree was doing on the res, because there's up to like 50 or 60 sun dances every summer, I believe, in just one of the counties. And there's 3 counties that make up the res. And so they wanted to know the health of the cottonwood tree. How is it doing? Is there enough? How is it doing in the wild? I think they have a tree planting initiative going on, but they wanted to know how they were doing in the wild. So I just started learning remote sensing. So I helped them at least identify trees. And so it's a neat culture science initiative here. And when I got hired on full time in 2011, this started a multi-year, 6-year, I think, initiative on many things. We work at the School of Mines and Technology here in South Dakota, you know, mapping, working with groundwater, surface water, gravels, and culture mixed in with all of that. And that's just me. I'm the last GeoProbe operator. Like I said, I've been here at this college for more or less since 2000. And so I got trained on all kinds of instruments and, you know, LiDAR, this GeoProbe, spectroscopy, and so I get stuck with all the GeoProbe work. It's cool, but man, it takes up. So they need to hire that out. I'm done with that thing. It takes up all my time, but it's fun getting soil samples. So we're working with the DOT on trying to help them find gravels. This is another unique cultural science twist. You see there's the Black Hills. There's some metamorphic rock originating from the Black Hills, and there was a paleo channel Medicine Root Paleo Channel carried, it was a huge river that carried and deposited these, and there's this huge deposit on the reservation where this channel was, but the gravels aren't ever, so we're helping them find exact locations of these gravels. And so here we are, I'm teaching students and OST, historical preservation officers and DOT people about the geoprobe, hoping one of them will want to operate it. And we have a School of Mines professor who used to do drilling, helping us, you know, with the samples. And but going back to THPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, they're there everywhere DOT goes, because, you know, I don't know a lot about cultural artifacts, archaeology, but what I did find out from them, they saying that's where they find all the goods, is in within these gravels. It houses all these arrow tips and all these other cultural artifacts in these gravels really well. So DOT is always getting shot down by THPO, saying, no, you can't dig there. In the end, I think that a higher governance has to step in and say, well, THPO, you got to let them dig somewhere. You know, we need our roads and houses built with this gravel. So they have to give in somewhere, because everywhere is culture. Just a blow up of that. Had a couple students help me on this, a couple faculty. It was a fun endeavor. So kind of to take you into the main thing, the Black Hills Visualization Project. This started with Sintegleshka University, where we did some of this, we did some of that, things with them, like I showed you. And they said, well, let's put a nice project together. And I thought, you know, I think I know enough to make a map. And at the time, John, and he's one of my cultural geospatial advisors, John Gozen Center, he's in Oglala. He says he's been doing GIS since early 90s, late 80s. And he said there's never been an official cultural map in the language of a tribe. And so I thought, all right, well, let's do this. And so I ended up calling this the Hesapa Ki Ianka Ochonkuso Sa, the Black Hills Red Racetrack. And it had many byproducts. So when you talk to elders, they don't tell you everything. So I'm talking to these elders, and they're saying, yeah, the Black Hills, there's a head in there, the top of the buffalo head. I thought, and then they're telling me a bunch of other things and side stories and all this. And I thought, whoa, you know, and they were done telling me about the buffalo head. So I had what little notes I had, and, you know, I never want to record them, because most don't, some do. And so I came back to them and I showed this to them. I go, is this what you meant? And boy, they got a kick out of it. They go, no, not at all. But they enjoyed it. I thought, well, the heart does look like a buffalo head. So totally off on this, but I leave it for humor, and that, you know, you don't always get the full details when you talk to elder. They want you to work for it too and think about it. There's a reason why they don't tell you everything right up front. So Teomini kind of hid you in there. That's in this area. This is the racetrack that goes around the hills. It's, by the way, the racetrack is you can see it's red now in this Landsat image. That's where the race took place. It's a Triassic spearfish formation. Oxidation, you know, causing the clays and all that to go red. So in here is Teomini. I got a few sites of Teomini mapped out here, but the actual Teomini I don't have yet. It would take more very personal visits with some elders to get that out of them, and my agenda in doing so. Here's just zoomed in on Peshla. That's the center of the hero. You've seen the sacred hoop. It's the round circle with the cross with our full colors in it. I think a lot of other tribes have something similar. Some use different colors, but that very center of where that cross meets is right here, Peshla. And then Engleshka, the salamander, you can kind of see right here. There's the head. I'll show turtles down here, Kea. So I'm in this is my GIS 2 class at School of Mines. my undergrad endeavor. And every project I did, you know, I'm an engineering student, but every single project I did was culture. And all my professors were cool with that. I'd throw in whatever engineering they wanted in there, but every single project I did was culture. And so I thought, well, I heard the stories, I've read the stories, I want to draw it in. And so here's my first attempt at that. And another side product, working with the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, they wanted a picture of Peshla. And of course, I jazzed up them to look a little nicer. Engleshka, Kea, and Peshla. And so that's kind of the red racetrack, a geologic unit I overlaid on there, and kind of made Engleshka and Kea look a little cleaned up a little. And these are the Badlands, Makówapi over here. I don't talk too much about that in this presentation, just more Black Hills-ish. So all this work accumulated to this Lakota map, Lakota Dakota map. The reason why I keep saying Lakota Dakota, the Lakota come from the Dakota. The Dakota were first, and then the Lakota and Nakota were derived. So, and we have different dialects. We are all together as one, but we're our own tribes. So if I were to say thank you, Pilamaye, I'm Lakota, so I'm L dialect. Pilamaye. A Dakota would say Pidamaya, and a Nakota would say Pinamaya. So throw that in there. So this is the first map. It took a small team, maybe a large team, of people to make this happen. This is back in, you know, it was made in 2006, I think, but this image wasn't so easy. There's 4 Landsat images that all come together right in the center at Peshla. So we have to deal with really about 6 or 8 Landsat images because of where this is placed, and still to this day. So it's never fun putting together my own Landsat imagery for this. And having bad internet here, and when I teach on the res, I have to have all the data, and so do my students. So we can never hardly work on the cloud. So we always have to get our own data and put it together, and good learning for them anyway. But this is in Lakota. The rivers are named, not all of them. It's just a start. And so I got a legend down here, and so it's, you know, I wish I could get back to this, and it's a 2001, I believe, Landsat image. The Jasper fire still, you know, just happened the year before. Big red spot there. I wish that wasn't there, but it is what it is, and it's done a lot of good. And so my cultural GIS advisor, John Gozencenter, gave me this slide, and he just wanted to show me how Amos Badhoe back in the 1890 drew the Black Hills out kind of like they are. So how do they know that? This is huge. I mean, it's no Rocky Mountains, but we're looking at 60 miles by what, 110 miles? How do they know? And Engleshka, the salamander, how do they know it was a salamander? That thing's bigger than a city. So it's really interesting how they know and see these things. They really knew the land well. And this was, you know, John B. Harrington's a Chickasaw astronaut. Kind of moving on with the project. We have through this Black Hills project, I also learned that we have a 3D north arrow, north, south, east, west, and what's above, what's below, and what's at the center. And I just kind of jazzed it up with the sites we were working on with St. Engleshka, because we're gearing up now. The Black Hills Visualization Project has now morphed into some kids camps. Dr. Jacqueline Bowman, she's a Brule Lakota. She was at the School of Mines at the time and wrote a grant for some kids camps, and they used the map that I had for the sites and all that. So this was the first kids camp that derived from it, to teach them, you know, atmospheric science, geology, and culture. They hired the Lakota Studies Department to come to the School of Mines campus, and they learned a mixture of the two and how to utilize and combine them and do neat things with them together. And this is another year, the Hisapa Blokechu Wo Ichun, Black Hills Summer Experience. And these were free for Native kids to attend. And so Victor DeVille, as I keep working with Sintigleshka, he took, wasn't easy back in the day, right? To just get images. You really had to work at making them. And so I got him this one, and he started labeling all the camps we went to. But then what was neat is he threw the triangle on it, which I need to get back to him. He's really old. I better get back to him soon. This triangle up in the Northern Hills. Now, this is really interesting culture. And it represents, he had the triangle off a little, so I corrected it for mine. It's really the filled in area. He had Iankaga off a little, but it forms this triangle. And really what that triangle is the buffalo skull. Now what that means, I'm not entirely sure yet, but it has to do with star knowledge. He's a big star knowledge person. He's probably the foremost leader in our culture with star knowledge. He even knows, all the culture star knowledges. And that's his main thing. And, that's why we are considered star people, which I think is cool. That's why you see our star quilt, that you see these jagged points and all our designs and all that. They're coming from the star, really. And so we are descendants of the stars. So anyway, this triangle formed during the solstice, and they have different names. Whoops. They have different names during this time. And so instead of Mato Tipila Bears Lodge or Bear Butte or, Iankaga, they have their different names. And he said couples would go there and try and conceive a baby during this time for special powers for their baby and special well-being and all that. And there's more meaning to it than this. So kind of talking about Iankaga, which is over here. So yeah, Iankaga. In literature, it's Ian Kara, because I don't think they liked Kaga, whoever rewrote it on their own. So it's hard to find Kaga, and it's really Kaga, not Kara. Kara is not a word in our language. So it's just one of my first project converts, where it was a GIS 3 class project, learning things, and I turned it over for cultural use. And so I got a bunch of cultural names tagged to it, and part of the racetrack is down here, you can see. And so moving on to Matopaha, Bear Butte, over here now. I used to, I don't think we're officially allowed to be activists, because all the faculty activists I've known in the past, they no longer are employed there for whatever reason. So I don't dare say I'm an activist, because I like having a job. But I do produce work, just pure science work, and say use it as you will. And so they wanted to know what a buffer looked like around Bear Butte to protect it. The protection's not going so well. There's all kinds of biker bars in that 1 mile area. They think it's to honor Bear Butte. That's how it is. And so just another view of that. Here's Sturgis. This is where you all probably heard 400 and something thousand people came to our state in August to celebrate the motorcycle rally. So it's shaped like a bear. Wait, what's the next slide? Okay, so it's shaped like a bear. You can see the back end here, shoulders and the head. And it's aimed towards the Badlands. This is also said to be the big bear you saw at Mato Tipila over in Wyoming, the tower. I don't call it the naughty name, by the way. You know what the naughty name is. So Bear Butte, this was me just messing around with LiDAR and classifying trees. you know, the nape imagery 4-band, or I don't know if I needed 4-band. Putting the trees on here just to give it a little jazzing it up for my classes and my students. Uh-oh, it won't advance. Oh, okay. So I just put showing the students and trying to teach it on how to classify your trees and then use the LiDAR data combo to, you know, just trying to get my students more into this, into geospatial stuff and with culture. I think this is an animation. Oh, okay. Yeah. So just trying to have them. And then these I tend to turn over to culture advisors, Lakota Studies Department classes, so they can use these for teaching their classes. And of course, I'm on the science when I teach my GIS classes on these things. So this is the place where I don't say the naughty name. I know you know what that is. Do you know and there are many tribes, even our enemy tribes, the Crow, traditional, I should say, enemy, historical enemy tribes. The Crow, you know, the Blackfeet, people over that way are some of our, in the way past. They even call this Bear Butte. And it's by all the tribes, you know, the bears, this used to be bear territory too. We didn't bother them, they didn't bother us. And that's probably how one of the stories came when, you know, some individuals went out into bear country, got chased up by the giant bear, which was the same bear that rests over at Bear Butte. So Mato Tipila up over here. So I did an internship in 2010 with Fugu Horizons, and they gave me this LiDAR data set to use because they weren't doing anything with it. And I just refer them ever since. And this is very early 2010 work. I didn't know how to work with LiDAR yet. So all I could do was just show it. You can see the tree meshes are still there. And my first animation, and then which I can't run apparently. Oh, there we go. And just for, you know, I'm trying to inspire our Lakota youth, my college students, you know, and just our Lakota Oyate, and educate the general public as well on why we don't call this the naughty name. I'm not a devil worshiper. And, you know, and so I got a little better working with LiDAR, you know. Now I know how to clean, no, I shouldn't say I know, I should say the software knows how to clean up data for me. But in saying that, in cleaning up the data, I can now look for lost paths that my elders have talked about. I can look for lost things. Oh, I timed myself for 40 minutes, so I got to hurry, huh? So I can look through things. But like I said, here's the names. I'm just getting better at working with things. This is all LiDAR and nape imagery. Kind of moving on to Hihan Kaga Paha. That's not true. Moving on to Mount Rushmore. I got a slide mixed up here. So before Mount Rushmore happened, it used to be Cougar Mountain, Igmu Tanka Paha, Cougars, mountain lions. And then when Black Elk made his way through there on his way up to what is now Harney Peak, the next slide, he had a vision. I think he got sick or something, and he had a vision of the 6 grandfathers, and he talked about them. And, you know, later that would change into Mount Rushmore. So back to Hihan Kaga Paha, it recently got changed to Black Elk Butte, although that is not a traditional name. There are several other traditional names, but they're all difficult to say. So they went with Hehaka Sapa Paha, Black Elk Butte. And it took the national board, geographers board or the USGS, that names things. Our state was against it. They tried their heart to not make this happen. And but the tribe found a way through the national board, and they totally agreed with it. So, and now the state has since tried to write in law that you can't do that. So that'll be interesting. Kind of moving down here to Te Taliopa. This is the way into the sacred hoop that I talked about. This is Hunkpapa Peak. They're a band of the Lakota, a smaller but fierce band. And because of that, when all the bands got together, the tribes got together, they got the honor of camping on the outer circle as the idea of being the protectors of the camp. And so therefore, they're the protectors of the sacred hoop. This is the way in and out. This is Highway 79. I'm looking west here, and it's on the way to Wind Cave, where we were said to come out of, from the stars to Wind Cave to come out. And so this is the buffalo used to use this path coming in and out of the Black Hills. And this is a really old image I made. But Victor DeVille got a hold of this and started putting star knowledge to it. So in our culture, what's below is above. So there's a racetrack here on the Black Hills. There's a racetrack up in the star knowledge. Bear Butte is here. It's up in the stars and so on. He's just trying to show that best he can with the images I gave him. There's the racetrack. You can see the round racetrack. Here's Teomni. It's a woman's part. There's a certain celestial era where Montotipila and the woman's part line up. I'm not sure when that is. And there are 7 names for Montotipila. I only gave you 2. Well, there's 3 really names. I don't see the naughty name. And so starting to move into the star knowledge world, a lot of things I get star knowledge and place-based in the Black Hills are from this book, which was Victor DeVille was a part of. A lot of other people were a part of it too. Just kind of, what's above is below. I haven't been working with him lately, but I need to. And he talks about, this is something I drew for my wife's birthday, but it's based off Victor's work. There's the racetrack you can see here. Here's Teomni, the woman's part. There's a hand. There's a story about the hand. The Big Dipper is, I think it's considered like the pipe. And over here is tobacco. Chanchasha, I forget the rest of the name. But there's supposed to be a certain celestial era when the sun shines through these and lights up the Big Dipper. I don't know when that is because I don't know my star knowledge. And there's Angleshka, like I showed you in the Black Hills. Kea is right up here. Peshla is right here. So spearfish, just another, so here's spearfish. This is Crazy Horse in the battle with the U.S. government. Probably, I would assume Custer at this point. They had formed a wall. I think they found out Crazy Horse's band, although they had no idea how big his bands really were, are making their way down here. And so he is said to have traveled in this northern hills, and there's all these medicinal plants that our people use. And, of course, I want to use remote sensing and find that and learn more about this. That he knew all the paths in and out of the Black Hills, so they could never find him in the Black Hills. Custer made his way through many of these parts, and they could never find. And there was actually a battle down here in the Southwest Hills that you probably don't read about because Custer had a retreat down here. So there was actually a skirmish before the big battle of the Greasy Grass where Custer lost. That happened in Montana. Here's just some spearfish work. It was a groundwater project I was doing, but I handed it over to some culture advisors, and they've given me cultural, like I said before, I call those cultural or project converts. Here's let me know how I'm doing on time. I got about a little bit left.
Yeah, you got about 10 minutes still.
Okay. So here I did some LiDAR in Wind Cave is what we were said to come out of. This is from Mammoth Cave. So we wanted to kind of do what they were doing. I wanted it for getting better with LiDAR, and they wanted for people who couldn't go in the cave, the Wind Cave National Park. But the Madison limestone is right here, and it goes all around the Black Hills, and that's where all the caves are. So Wind Cave is somewhere in here. Oh, right here, Wind Cave. So here we're starting to take some LiDAR of it, and you can kind of see inside the LiDAR right here. And I thought, well, LiDAR is just data, right? So I made it look like water because water was in there, right? At one point in time, because it's limestone. And I also consider them the veins. I consider the heart and I consider the rivers the veins of the hills. So I just, for fun, made the data look like water. And here I'm just kind of zooming in on the data. It was 5 centimeter, but we downgraded it for processing purposes. And so it was just some fun work, I guess. Here's some place naming I was doing with Sinti Gleshka University. We're starting to name the domain of the 16 states and all that. We didn't get too far, but we did get far, and groups were started, coalitions were started, and this collective, if you will, was started on place naming. You know, and it took a lot of team building on the cultural side. Groups were made of elders to agree upon these site names. Here's the start of the 16 and 3 Canadian provinces, 16 states. I was working with Wilmer until he passed away. But this other guy, Dakota Wynn, started doing it himself. He's a historian, Lakota historian, using it. So I took some of his data and laid his data out. And his data is massive of Lakota place names and is reaching out towards that 16 state, 3 Canadian provinces area. And I think there's enough data here to start mining it for other stories I've heard about. My wife is a she's learned machine learning. She's a programmer, and she gave me all kinds of ideas. I'm just starting to learn Python and the cool things that I could learn from this data. This is to represent there are somewhere out there locations that lead to the boundary of this idea of Lakota Dakota boundaries of the Black Hills. And Black Hills are in here. There are sites that have been found by ranchers or whatever that are significant place markers that I'm working on. But really the last thing I want to get to here is the Black Hills and that heart and the geological, hydrological. So here's just a very complicated geologic map of the hills. Just wanted to show you that. I'm borrowing just the water formations, the Madison and Menalusa formations. They're the groundwater areas. But before I do this, most geologic formations are in the local native culture. And I think this geologist took consideration of that and talked to some knowledgeable Lakota people back in the day. His name was Darton. And I think he purposely strategically named locations, formations, and named them in a cultural way. And so I just called my old professor up, asking where I could find such notes. He gave me some leads. So back to that heart and that formation. Here's where all the groundwater is in the area, except for here, it's the plateau, it's out. And so the heart. If anything's last thing I want to share with you, we call it the heart of everything that is, the heart of the planet. It beats, all the streams start here in the Black Hills and they all go out. And, having a geology background, we studied some faults. There's a monocline right here. This is all these are other faults, but there's a monocline here. And because of that, it diverts some of the groundwater to the west, a smaller portion like your heart does, right? Isn't that called, that's called the interventricular septum in your heart. And the other diverts all the water to the east, which is your left, right? And because of that monocline, it's separating the water like that. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting how that ties in to the stories and to science. And Lakota elders said that big, you know, that big bear at Makówapi that chased the people up the tower and made some imprints across the northern hills when he laid to rest over at Bear Butte, which is right here. And the only thing I can find scientifically is the igneous intrusions. I forget the actual name for this. Northern Hills intrusions. They're newer geologic intrusions that happened up here. You know, Makówapi, Bear Butte, all the skiing resorts, very high. I thought that's interesting how those correlate together. Oh, that was my last slide. Here are, I can share this slide with you all. Here are some references to a lot of things, you know, some people that have done some really neat things. Might help you understand a little bit more of what I'm talking about. That's it. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Jim. We do have time for a few questions. So if folks have a question, maybe turn your camera on so Jim can see who's asking.
Should I stop sharing or?
Sure.
Okay.
Or you can raise your hand on the participants list and I can sort of call on you. See some thank yous in the chat. Jody, looks like your camera is on. I'm assuming you have a question.
Yeah, hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. I also make a living looking at maps and making maps, and your maps are really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. My question has to do with, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that when someone comes to like propose a collaboration or to work together, you and the elders are thinking about, okay, what does this person want? And likewise, what could we potentially, what would be the benefits to us? And so I was curious if you feel comfortable to speaking to the tribal perspective, what kinds of things, like, what kind of things do you want? Or when you see, what certain kind of benefits do you hope for, or are you looking for when you're thinking about collaborations?
Since I'm in the academic world, usually I'm looking for, I want to bring my students on board. And I want you to work with my students to work with your students. That's usually if I can get that out of it, you know, I'm usually good. And really, and the only place it really gets touchy is just with cultural stories and all that. There are plenty of other land resources, you know, they contract out, no problem. You know, there's plenty of outsiders working with all the tribal entities, forest management, land management, water quality, all that is contracted out. Unfortunately, all of it's contracted out because they don't have the expertise for that. So, but it's really just touchy with the culture. But regardless of what I do, whether it's culture or it is science or engineering, that's usually what I want is, hey, work with our students. Let them make sure they get something out of this.
Great, thank you.
I guess kind of following on to that, because the beginning of your story, you sort of highlighted the importance of the different mentors that helped get you into some of these ideas and give you the space to sort of explore them. There's a number of students on the seminar today who are maybe hoping to do similar things. And so I wonder if you can speak to how they might be better mentors for students hoping to do mapping within a cultural context.
Say it again.
So I'm imagining you sort of pointed out that one of your original mentors was a German gentleman at the college.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sort of wondering, because place naming can be such a contentious sort of endeavor, how might our students be good mentors to some of your students, should we end up being able to collaborate, or should they go on to sort of become teachers within tribal colleges, et cetera? What are there special things that made those mentor relationships you had before more helpful?
I think our students, for example, are already set up to, that it's just in our culture, really, not that it's in our department, that you have a cultural advisor. Whether it's grandma, sometimes your grandparents might not have that knowledge. It wasn't the duty of everyone to retain it. So certain families are really strong with it. So we reach out to them. So they already kind of have that, especially the reservation students, born and raised, they have that embedded in them that, I don't know, I better talk to grandma first, or I better talk to so-and-so first before I agree with you, or I want to move on with this. If it's a city Indian, they can reach out to Lakota Studies Department or the local tribal college. They have, Native Studies departments you could go to. That's who I go to often. Tribal colleges usually have a green light from the tribe to move forward with such initiatives without having to go through a tribal historic preservation office. Because they would have ultimate say, but they've kind of given their tribal colleges, so it's, that green light to move forward on such things. And if they feel they need to reach out to them, they will. But that's what I do mostly, is go to our Lakota Studies Department for cultural advice.
Thanks. I see Callie has turned on her camera. This is probably the last question we have time for. I want to be conscious of Jim's time.
Yeah, do we have one more? Otherwise I can put it in the Slack channel. But I was just wondering, Jim, if you could speak to a little bit how your philosophy of map making has changed as you've incorporated more and more stories into what you're doing, and how you now, like how the academic process has influenced that.
What I've learned is none of this happens without stories from our elders, right? Because none of this is published anywhere, or there's nowhere else to get it. So it's do it their way or no way. You could try and find a few things out there, you'll burn up your resources, and you'll be right back to wanting to work with elder societies within any tribe. And so what I've learned is, don't be like a geographer. Don't be like an engineer. Don't be like, what's the other field they hate? Archaeologists. They hate those fields. But they need them. And they know they need them, and I know they need them, and I'm one of them. But don't be like them. And don't approach them with that traditional scientific method approach. You're going to lose them. That's what I've learned. It has to be more of a conversation type, first, and why are you doing this? Why are you working with them? Because remember, they're not going to trust you right off the bat. And be honest. I let some universities use me and my college because of our name, right, for a grant. But then in return, I tell them what I want. I go, I know you need my name on there. It's going to get you that grant. It's going to put you above these other institutions because you're working with the tribal college. I know that avenue, and that's okay. What am I going to get out of it? How are we going to, get out of this? And yeah, just being honest about it. But yeah, really taking those approaches. And, sometimes I've had to copyright stuff too. Did that answer your question?
I think that, covered the main parts of it. Thank you. That was really insightful.
As an engineer, definitely don't be like an engineer when I approach my people. they're the toughest to work with.
Well, we are out of time for this week. I want to say thanks again to James for spending the time with us. For the students who are registered in the course, you can keep the conversation going in the Slack channel for the next week or so. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you again live next week. Thanks again,
everyone.
Thank you.